Hey, welcome back to the other part of chapter 12. I hope you guys are doing really good. And again, I can't stress this enough. Okay, if you have questions about anything, please don't hesitate to ask me. Send me an email. Please make it a point to watch the videos. Please make it a point to read the textbook. Please make it a point to go through the PowerPoint slides. Please make it a point to go see the essay. And most importantly, make it a point to actually come talk to me, please. My office doors are always open. You can send me an email. Just make a note of what you don't understand, and I'll be more than happy to talk to you. Okay, so then objective number 2, we're basically going to look at inflation cycles. Okay, so essentially we're trying to see what determines inflation in an economy. Okay, what determines that the price level in an economy rises over time? What determines the cost of living um in an economy, or basically in a country? Okay, so we have demand pull inflation and we have cost push inflation. Okay, so already in chapter 5 we did talk about the quantity theory of money, right? And I said the quantity theory of money is one of my favorite theories. Okay, right? But the quantity theory of money basically explains money in the sense of, or inflation in the sense of the long run. Okay, right? So we know that as economists, we know that in the long run inflation only happens if the quantity of money generally tends to grow at a faster rate than real GDP. This is due to the quantity theory of money equation. We have inflation, which is I equals the quantity of money minus real GDP growth rate. Okay, so if the quantity of money growth rate is faster than real GDP growth rate, well, this whole figure becomes a whole lot bigger, okay, in terms of math. Okay, right? Okay, so for example, if M equals 5 and real GDP growth rate is only 3, right? The money growth rate, which is 5, is faster or greater than real GDP growth rate, and hence you get an inflation rate of, let's say, 2%. Okay, we know this happens in the long run, and again, when we say long run, essentially we're talking about the long term sort of economy. Okay, but what happens in the short run? Okay, in the immediate term, what actually causes inflation? What causes goods and services, or the general price level of goods and services in an economy, to basically go up? What influences the cost of living in a country? Okay, right. Now, in the short run, you have a plethora of factors that basically influence inflation. Okay, but there are two main things we'll look at. Okay, we'll look at demand pull inflation. Okay, and we'll look at cost push inflation. Okay, so these are the only two types of inflation I want you to think about right now. Okay, demand pull inflation and cost push inflation. Okay, now what is demand pull inflation? Okay, every time you think of demand pull inflation, your mind should go to aggregate demand. Okay, so I'm just going to write aggregate demand here, and sort of the name suggests that it has something to do with demand. Okay, so demand pull inflation comes about when any factor causes an increase in aggregate demand. Any factor that increases aggregate demand will eventually increase the price level and will lead to what we call demand pull inflation. Okay, right. So again, demand pull inflation is inflation that comes about, or an increase in the price level that comes about due to an increase in aggregate demand. Okay, an increase in the price level that is due to an increase in aggregate demand. Okay, now at this point you need to know all the factors that actually increase aggregate demand. Again, aggregate demand has to do with a rightward shift of the aggregate demand curve. Okay, you need to know the factors that increase aggregate demand, and then please, if you don't understand these factors, please don't hesitate to talk to the SI, or please don't hesitate to talk to me as well. Okay, so what are some of the factors that increase aggregate demand? Think about it, see if you can actually remember them, see if you can actually talk about them. Okay, see if you can actually recollect them. Okay, and pause the video at this point to try and see if you can actually remember some factors that actually increase aggregate demand. Now, the first factor I want to talk about is a reduction in interest rate. Okay, now when interest rates in the economy are low, so I'll just say interest rate. Okay, so I'll just use R. When interest rates in an economy are low, businesses tend to invest more. Why? Because they can actually borrow money or more money at a really, really low interest rate. Okay, so investment increases. Now we know that investment is basically a component of AD, right? Because we have AD equals real GDP, which equals C plus I plus G plus NX. Okay, so in that sense, if investment increases, assuming everything else is held constant, well, then AD is going to increase as well. Okay, so reduction in interest rates. So suppose interest rates in the economy reduce, right? Investments are going to increase. Okay, but not only that, consumption expenditure increases as well. Okay, every time interest rates on your credit card are low, or every time interest rates, right, tend to be low on a loan, okay, people actually borrow more, right? And for example, with your credit card, if the interest rates are low, okay, people actually spend more on their credit card, and by spending more, you actually increase consumption expenditure. Remember, consumption expenditure is basically expenditure done by households. Okay, right. And then another factor that actually increases aggregate demand is an increase in the quantity of money. When the quantity of money, MS, which is money supply, increases, there's more money in the economy. Okay, so people feel more wealthy. People gain more money because you've printed more money. Okay, so people gain more money and they feel more wealthy. Now, when you feel more wealthy, you decide to splurge. You decide to go to the mall. You decide to do online shopping. Okay, so your consumption expenditure increases. Again, consumption expenditure is basically tied to aggregate demand through that equation I showed you earlier. Okay, so if consumption expenditure is increasing, it means that aggregate demand mathematically has to increase as well. Okay, right. Also, we have increase in government expenditure. Again, aggregate demand is tied to G, which is government expenditure, plus C plus I plus NX. Okay, this equation is really important. Okay, so if governments basically spend more, if the federal governments decide to basically buy more planes or spend more on infrastructure, okay, aggregate demand also increases. So one thing you should probably remember, or you should probably realize by now, is that anything that actually increases spending tends to increase aggregate demand as well. Okay, another example is tax cuts. If the federal government decides to basically lower taxes, right, that is essentially going to increase aggregate demand because people will decide to spend more. If the federal government lowers taxes, you have more income, so you decide to splurge. Again, once you have income, people normally tend to spend more. Okay, so that increases aggregate demand. Okay, right. And then finally, we have an increase in exports. Okay, and that comes about due to the fact that net exports is increasing, right, and aggregate demand is increasing. Okay, so demand pull inflation comes about because aggregate demand is increasing and the price level generally increases. Okay, now let me show you how this works. So now we have the price level on our y-axis, and we have real GDP on our x-axis. Again, aggregate demand basically shows you the relationship between the price level and the quantity of real GDP demanded, and basically it is downward sloping, meaning that as the price level increases, aggregate demand or the quantity of real GDP demanded basically decreases. Okay, so aggregate demand is downward sloping. And then we have the short run aggregate supply, which we know is upward sloping. And then we have the long run aggregate supply, which we basically know is vertical. Okay, and the point where all these three curves meet is basically our point of equilibrium. Okay, so we have point A, and point A is essentially our point of equilibrium. Okay, so in that sense, our equilibrium price level is 110. And our equilibrium GDP is basically $18 trillion in this example. Okay, now let's see how aggregate demand causes a demand pull inflation. Okay, now if aggregate demand increases, right, that will be a rightward shift of the aggregate demand curve. Okay, so all the factors I mentioned earlier will basically cause aggregate demand to increase. Okay, so that is a rightward shift of the demand curve. Now notice, when there's a rightward shift of the demand curve, the price level increased from 110 to 113. Okay, and we define the inflation as an increase in the price level. Okay, so already we can see inflation happening. Okay, but also GDP increased from 18 to 18.5 trillion dollars. Now, that is what happens when there's an increase in aggregate demand. The price level increases and GDP increases as well. Okay, now when the price level increases, it causes what we call an inflationary gap. Okay, so now we need to know what an inflationary gap is. Okay, an inflationary gap is when actual GDP, let me just say actual GDP is greater than potential GDP. So I'll just call it PGDP for short. When actual GDP is greater than potential GDP, generally it means that in the short run, the economy is producing way too much, okay? So in this sense, our actual GDP is got by looking at the intersection of the AD curve with the short run aggregate supply curve, okay? So point B here is our actual GDP, is our new GDP, okay? So in this case, our actual GDP is 18.5 and is greater than 18 trillion, okay? Just $18 trillion, okay? So we have what we call an inflationary gap. Now, every time you have an inflationary gap, right, basically people demand more wages, okay? So in this example, the price level, right, increasing is the first step in the demand pull inflation. Now, every time you have an inflationary gap, people demand more wages because basically the economy is booming. Okay, there's an economic expansion, everything is going well, so wages tend to rise. Okay, nominal wages tend to rise or salaries rise. At the same time, every time the economy is experiencing an inflationary gap, right, there's a brief increase in prices, so people agitate for higher wages. Okay, people essentially agitate for higher wages. Okay, and they basically get that. We assume they get that. Okay, so when nominal wages rise and when the money wage rate increases, okay, what is going to happen is that the short-run aggregate supply curve is going to decrease and the economy is going to correct itself to actually close that inflationary gap, okay? So essentially, the economy wants to close this gap over here, right here. The economy doesn't like it. It wants to close it and basically go to the normal level of GDP, which is $18 trillion, okay? Right now, there's going to be an increase in the money wage rate. So if there's an increase in the money wage rate, producers have to lay people off, okay? So when producers lay people off, the short-run aggregate supply curve is essentially going to decrease, okay? And when the short-run aggregate supply curve decreases, it will shift essentially to the left, okay? It will shift to the left and will shift to the point where essentially, right, you have the long run aggregate supply curve, okay? So you move from point B till you get to point C, where you have the intersection of the new short run aggregate supply curve, the old long run aggregate supply curve, and the new aggregate demand curve, okay? So the money wage rate rises and the short run aggregate supply curve is going to shift to the left, okay? So the price level will basically increase from 113 to 121, and GDP will basically go back to normal, meaning the gap is basically closed. So this gap over here is basically closed, okay? So the price level rises and GDP goes back to potential GDP, okay? And essentially, initially, our price level was 110, but now our price level has increased all the way to 121, right? And again, we define inflation as the increase in the price level, okay? So in that sense, we actually have inflation caused by a change in aggregate demand, okay? We have inflation caused by the change in aggregate demand. Again, guys, please pause the video where you have to, and if you don't understand anything, please let me know. Send me an email and say, hey, Dr. Kweku, I just want to talk to you. I don't understand this. Please explain it to me. And I'll be more than happy to explain it to you. Right? So this is essentially demand pull inflation. Okay? This is essentially demand pull inflation. Right? Just to make sure that you actually understand it, take a second and look at this class activity. Suppose the federal government awards a $1,200 stimulus check to consumers, okay? So during the COVID recession, that is basically what happened, right? The federal government decided to mail everyone a $1,200 stimulus check to actually influence people to spend more in order to influence aggregate demand, which actually, increase GDP, okay? So now explain in words or graphs how this will lead to a demand pull inflation, okay? So at this point, I want you to pause the video and try and see if you can actually answer this question, okay? But actually help you in answering the question, okay? Now, every time we say something about demand pull inflation, right, you need to remember your curves, okay? So we have GDP over here, and we have the price level over here. I'll just call it P. Again, we have our long run aggregate supply curve, which is always vertical. I'll call it LAS. And we have our short run aggregate supply curve, which is always upward sloping. I'll call it SAS. And we have our short run aggregate demand curve, which is always downward sloping. And we call it AD. And basically, they're all going to meet at a point of, let's say this is our point A. That is our equilibrium point, okay? So the initial price level in this economy is basically P star. And the initial GDP in this economy is basically, let's just say, G star. Okay. Now, suppose the federal government awards the 1,200 stimulus checks to consumers. Well, consumers will like to spend that money, okay? So consumption expenditure will increase. You are $1,200 richer. You decide to splurge. You decide to spend that money, okay? If consumption expenditure increases, aggregate demand also increases, okay? So we know that our aggregate demand curve is going to shift to the right, okay? So I'll just use a different color. Let me just use green. And aggregate demand curve will shift to the right, okay? So we basically have a new aggregate demand curve, okay? I'll just call this AD1, okay? And we have a new point of equilibrium, right? Which is basically point B. As you see, the price level basically increases from P star to P double star. And GDP momentarily increases from G star to G double star, okay? So now we have, again, an inflationary gap, okay? Because our actual GDP, which is G star, is greater than our potential GDP, which is G star. So sorry, our actual GDP, which is G double star, is greater than our potential GDP, which is just G star, okay? So there's a gap over here. This shaded area basically causes a gap, okay? In that sense, since there's a gap and since the economy is expanding, wages tend to increase. People feel more wealthy, okay? Or they demand higher wages because price level has also increased, okay? But now, when there are higher wages, it's more costly to produce, because if you think about it from a producer standpoint, if wages are higher, okay, they lay people off. If you have to pay people, your workers, higher wages, okay, it becomes more costly to produce a good or service, so you lay people off, okay? Now, if you're laying people off, that reduces production, and that basically affects the amount of total goods and services that can be produced in the economy, which is basically denoted by the short-run aggregate supply curve, okay? So in that sense, the short-run aggregate supply curve will shift to the left, but it will shift to the left so it actually gets to the point where it actually intersects the new aggregate demand curve and the old, and basically the long aggregate supply curve at potential GDP right here at point C, okay? So then we have the new SAS curve. I'll call it SAS1, okay? So now let's compare the very old equilibrium point, which is point A. Initially, the economy was at point A with a price level P star. Now the economy is at point C with a price level, let's say P triple star, okay? So P triple star, okay? Now, what we can say is that due to an increase in aggregate demand, P star has increased to P triple star. Okay, in that sense, price level has increased, and this has led to inflation. Okay, this has led to inflation. Okay, so essentially that is how demand pull inflation works. Again, guys, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask me. Next time we'll look at cost push inflation. Thank you.